And you see why Brad Byers is rising up as the mission leader in this church. Good guy. Thank you, Brad. Once there was one who came to us, who touched the untouchables, turned his back on the world's bright baubles, loved even unto death, and never turned his eyes away from God. And we hated him for it. He came to us with wide open hands and gracious invitation, seeking us, both patient with us and hotly pursuing us, and thereby he brought out the very worst in us. We figured that things between us and God were not all that bad. But when he spoke to us about God and ourselves, and rubbed our noses in the filthy rags of our presumed righteousness, well, we thought we were good until we met him. He called upon us to attempt great moral feats and then watched as we fell flat on our faces. He invited us to join up with his kingdom and then set that kingdom's demands so high that when it came time for us to stand up and show what we were made of, we fled, slithering into the darkness. He said, "Come to me. Take my yoke upon you." And we, with one voice, cried, "Crucify him." That is how Duke Divinity School professor William Willimon began his book, Sinning Like a Christian. What a great title for a book, Sinning Like a Christian. Subtitle, A New Look at the Seven Deadly Sins. It was his way of getting into a subject most people don't want to talk about, don't want to think about, don't want to even just dwell on it anywhere, because it puts the white-hot light of scrutiny on the worst parts of our beings, on our sins. That introduction was Dr. Willimon's start to saying that any church that eliminates talk about sin has abandoned one of the core components of the gospel itself, the very message that we bear, the message of our faith, the gospel message, to eliminate one of the core components. If Jesus came to bring into this world the good news, which is the definition of gospel, it means good news. If Jesus came to bring the message of the good news, to bring the good news itself, it can only be understood in contrast with the bad news. And what is the bad news, if not sin? So Dr. Willimon wants to present a more scripturally faithful alternative to what he calls the promiscuously permissive, user-friendly Jesus of modern culture. For all these reasons and more, Dr. Willimon wants the churches to talk more about sin, but he also wants us to talk about sin as part of, not as the sum total of, the gospel message. Sin is only part of the story. Of course, we love the other part of the story, the rest of the story. Grace and mercy and forgiveness and new life and new hope and the new ways of being are the rest of the story. It is the rest of the gospel. But that part of the story, if you think about it, it doesn't even make sense if you don't know the first part of the story. If you don't think about the first part of the story. Act 2 of the play does not make sense unless you have been a part of and paid attention to Act 1. It is time for us as a congregation to talk about Act 1. This series is about sin. This series will help us treasure Act 2, the grace of God that is given to us in Jesus Christ. And so today we begin a new series called 7. And I'll tell you that part of the inspiration for this book, for the series, was not Dr. Willimon's book, but it was another book. It was a book that was written and sent to me by a classmate of mine from Princeton Seminary, Lori Jackson, and her book title was what it was called Little White Lies and Seven Deadly Sins. And she begins her book with this. Let's be honest, she says. You'd rather talk about sin than sit around chatting about saintliness. Who doesn't enjoy rubbernecking to see sin in action? As long as it's someone else's sin, of course, and not yours. So we don't want to talk about personal sins. This is where she starts her book. We don't want to talk about personal sins, but we're happy to talk about and to point out or condemn everyone else's sins. And we are happy. Think about this as a people. We are happy to point out the moral failures of everyone from our own family member to the President of the United States or some other political leaders. We're happy to point out all of these other people's failures, but not our own. And if understanding sin rightly is essential to understanding the work of Jesus, and if we have gone heavy-handed with judging others while ignoring our own sin, we do need a fresh look, or as Dr. Willimon said, a new look at sin, so that we can see it in the context of the life of the faith to which we are all called. And that is what this series is all about. So I begin in the book, the New Testament book of 1 Peter, and if you know anything about the cast of characters who are around Jesus, this is the Peter, the one who became the loud and outspoken the leader of the 12 that Jesus called to himself. This is the same Peter who 3 times, when Jesus was going through that terrible night where he was going through all those trials, 3 different times, Peter, who declared only hours before, I will stand by you to the very end, denied that he even knew Jesus. This is the same Peter. Now he's moved on past it. Now he has been restored. Now things have been made right. Now he is in leadership in the new church that has formed after the book of Acts and all that happened in the book of Acts. And now he is writing this letter to encourage these Christians who had scattered away from Jerusalem, and they were living in what is today the country of Turkey, the area in the middle of Turkey. And he reminds them of all that they have in their faith, in order to give them hope in the middle of their present suffering. And then he calls them to stay faithful. And he also calls them to pursue holiness. And that's really what captures me today. This idea of calling them in the middle of their hardship to pursue holiness. Here's how he says it. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 through 16. Therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all that you do. For it is written, be holy, because I am holy. So I want to unpack that a little bit, looking first at that verse 13 there. Therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming. That phrase there, with minds that are alert. I love in the King James version of this, it says, gird up the loins of your mind. Isn't that a great saying? Gird up the loins of your mind. The image is of a man kind of wearing this long robe, and he takes the folds of his robe and he tucks it into his belt. So I think in the South we would say, hitch up your britches, is what he would say. So kind of the idea of hitching up your britches so that you'd be able to adjust quickly to changing situations, and no matter what the changing situations or circumstances of your life, you are always ready to quickly move and never lose sight of. You have great hope in every situation, in any moment in life. Gird up the loins of your mind, with minds that are alert and fully sober. Then he says, set your hope on the grace that is to be revealed, on the grace that Jesus will bring. There's a reference here to Jesus' second coming. When Jesus, it's future to even us here today. It's a reference to when Jesus will come back to this earth and to keep looking to the future for the best possible life ever. The best things are not in the past, the best things are in the future. In 1 John chapter 3, verses 2 and 3, we read John saying, dear friends, now we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been known. But we know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him. We shall see him as he is. All who have this hope in him purify themselves just as he is pure. So now we are called God's children. But then, when Christ returns, then we will be like Christ. We will be pure like Christ. And John is saying not to wait until Christ returns to pursue purity in our lives. Pursue it now. Pursue holiness now. And Peter certainly would agree with that. Verse 14, 1 Peter 1:14, as obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. Do not conform to the evil desires that you had when you lived in ignorance. Have you ever had someone remind you of your past? You ever had someone, like the things you did wrong in your past? You ever had anybody remind you of your past sins, your past failures, your shortcomings, the things that you did, the things that you said? Anybody ever had that? Don't nudge the person next to you. Don't even look at them. No, you want to. Peter points out their past. He reminds them that they have a past, and he reminds them that he's reminding them that he's not shaming them because they have a past. He's reminding them that because he's making a point here, similar to how Paul did with Christians who were living in the city of Ephesus in Ephesians chapter 2. Paul writes, all of us also lived among them, referring to the disobedient. All of us lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. Paul reminds them that they have left that lifestyle. They left that lifestyle behind when they became believers. They left their sins in their past. They left those kind of patterns in their past. They had a past, but it's exactly that. It is a past. Maybe you come in here today and that's what you need to hear more than anything today. More than anything else. Maybe that's what you need to hear today. Maybe a new temptation has arisen in your life. Maybe a new desire that you know is not from God has come into your life. And Paul would say, listen, don't forget about something here. You left that behind you. When you started following Jesus, you left that behind you. Whatever it is, some sin or some bitterness or some language or some moral failure, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived without knowing Christ. Your past is your past. Leave it there. Leave it there. And here's the last two verses. Verses 15 and 16. But just as he who called you is holy, so you be holy in all that you do. For it is written, be holy, because I am holy. This is straight up out of the Old Testament with Moses calling the people of God to be like God. Take a look. He goes at it in Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 44. I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. Do not make yourselves unclean by any creature that moves along the ground. I am the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore, he says it again, be holy, because, here it is again, I am holy. Fast forward, chapter 19, verse 2. Speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, be holy. Here it is again. Because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Next chapter, verse chapter 20. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am the Lord your God. And so in our passage, Peter, echoing all these words of Moses, Peter is calling the people of God, because they are the people of God, to be holy like God is holy, which sounds so good, doesn't it? It kind of sounds so simple when just to hear it. It sounds so simple to say, God is holy, we are God's people, strive to be holy ourselves. Easy peasy, right? I mean, you're a holy person, right? Right? I mean, if you were at a party sometime, somebody says, hey, tell me about you. You would surely start out a conversation. If you were at a party, somebody asked about what kind of person you were to tell them about you. You would surely start out and say, well, the first thing I'd like to tell you is that I am a holy person. That's how it goes, right? Starts that way, right? Right? No, it doesn't start that way at all, does it? Why is that? Well, first thing, because that's weird, right? you'd be like, you see that guy over there? What is that? But the second thing, it's hard to say those words about yourself because you know better than anyone else exactly why and when and how and the details of why you do not feel holy in your life. You know that only minutes earlier than whatever conversation you might have had, you were furious and you were cussing that driver who cut you off in traffic. Yeah. It's the flash of reaction in the room. They're like, that was you. Or you know only an hour ago that you were lusting after that bigger home or some other thing in life. Or at dinner last night, you know how much you overate to the point of being nearly sick. Or you can think of those times when you were burning with envy over that person who has that better something. You fill in the blank. Better kids, better spouse, better home, better car, better whatever it is. You know your tendency to take the path of least resistance and ignore the diligent hard work of doing the right things. In other words, we resist declaring ourselves holy because we know all too well our own what? Our sin. And so it's that tension between striving to reflect God's holiness and living out our lives on the one hand, and on the other hand, knowing all too well the reality of how far short we fall of that and how we deal with the everyday sins, we deal with them all the time. That is really what this series is all about. Knowing that there is that tension, that in spite of that reality, in spite of these realities of sin, and through those sins, and while living with those sins, we are called to another way. We are called to holy living. It has to be something inside us that, yes, that is, God, I hear you that you want that in me, and so I want to pursue that in my life as well. We are called to strive for holiness at work. Think about that. In your workplaces, you are called to be holy men and women. You are called to strive to be holy at school. And in your organizations that you are a part of, and at home, and at leisure. And you are called to strive to be holy in church as well. In the end, the series is about holy living. And it begins by understanding that there are these things that block holy living. We are calling them in this series 7 deadly sins. I don't know about you. You may not have ever heard of this thing called 7 deadly sins. If you did, it's like just floating around. Like I sort of had maybe kind of heard about this. Take a look. First off, just so you know, this is the list of the 7 deadly sins that come to us out of church history that began really in around the 4th century here. So it should be a list of 7. There they are. The 7. Say them with me now: pride, envy, gluttony, lust, anger, greed, and sloth. And I'm going to say a few words about them today, about that list of 7 today. But we're going to dig into the first one on that list, pride. We're going to dig into that on Wednesday, because this Wednesday is Ash Wednesday. And that will be the topic for Ash Wednesday. We'll dig into the subject of pride. And the rest of them we're going to cover week after week leading up to Easter. And for each of these topics, for each of these deadly sins, I'm also going to name one counterbalancing virtue. So you could think of it, this series is about the 7 deadly sins as well as the 7 heavenly virtues. Okay, that's kind of where we're going. And the first thing to say about that list of 7 is this: the 7 don't seem so deadly when you think about it. They don't seem so deadly. In spite of the heated debates and all the issues around 2 of them, lust and gluttony, the 2 that the 11th century theologian Thomas Aquinas called the carnal sins. In spite of all the energy around those 2 in particular, probably the first one in particular, the lust and gluttony, it is the other 5, the pride and envy and anger and greed and sloth, that are far more detrimental to the spiritual condition of the behavior. And if you think about it, they may well fuel the other 2, the carnal sins themselves. But even knowing that that's the sort of backstory on those things, the 7 still don't seem all that deadly when you think about that particular list. They don't seem all that deadly. Surely there are more serious sins than these. Where, for example, is political tyranny? I'll see that on the list. The wreckage that has come out of that. Where is racial violence? Where is sexual violence? Where is murder? Where is alcoholism or some other addiction and its family-crushing after effects? Where is religious persecution on the list? The problem, of course, which is even thinking that way, is that the reality is that each of the 7 that are on the list, each of the 7 lived out over time is where the problem comes in. Lived out over time, there are core issues that will warp our good createdness and lead us to living distorted lives from what God intends. So, for example, if we watch a 2-year-old steal a toy from another 2-year-old, we almost think that's cute. I mean, it's cute to everyone but the other 2-year-old. But we almost think that's kind of cute to see that happening. But you fast forward to a 42-year-old cheating on an expense report, stealing from the company that way. It's not cute at all anymore. It's actually criminal. Or we may think about a teenager being ambivalent or indifferent, that being one thing. They kind of have that ambivalent and indifferent attitude towards life, but then you see a grown man or a grown woman with complete lack of passion for anything, resulting in slothful, middle-aged behavior or person. It's quite another story. So the list really seems simple on the surface, but lived out over time, it's harmful to who we are supposed to be. And so the first observation is they don't seem so deadly. The second observation is that salvation is not at stake here. Now, people often get this wrong. Sin does not disqualify us from receiving God's forgiveness, God's love, or God's grace. Sin is actually the precursor to receiving that. Jesus died for what? For people's sins, for the sins of the world. Jesus saves sinners. Jesus saves only sinners. That's the point. Many people act like if you even have one sin, that's it for you. It's lights out. God is against you. God is standing over you with a little button that says smite you, right ready to get you. One little thing, bam, you're gone. It's not true. Talk about missing the point. None of these 7 deadly sins eliminate us from God's love and God's grace and forgiveness. The problem is elsewhere. I like how Dr. Willimon says it. The 7 remind us that sin is not so much the popular doing what you know you're not supposed to do, but rather a perverted being who we are. The problem is when we are living with these sins unchecked, it distorts who we are in our essence. 3 more things to say about this, and then I want to close out this for today. The first one is this. Sin is serious. If indeed sin diminishes our essential being, if it diminishes who we are as a person, if it takes us away from the best possible life for us, we have to take sin seriously. Sin is serious. You need to just remind that, hang that out there. Second thing to say is this: what we do with sin is we confess it in ourselves. We confess it to God about ourselves. Don't get hung up on the word confession. Confession just means to declare what is real, to state what is a reality. That's why sometimes we wrote these statements of faith. They call them confessions of faith. So sometimes we think confession is when you go into a little booth and there's a little screen and a guy on the other side, and you got to tell the guy on the other side everything that you did wrong. That is one way of thinking about confession. The larger way of thinking about confession is declaring what is true about ourselves to God. And yes, sometimes it's declaring the sin that is true about ourselves to God. It is being brutally honest and making sure that we see that clearly in ourselves. And so the third thing to say is that we have a higher vision than our sin. And that really is where we're going to land with this whole series here. This is about holy living. This is about that higher vision. If there are 7 deadly sins, the better picture, the higher vision, and the aspirational life is with the opposite heavenly virtues. Instead of pride, we have the virtue of humility to strive for. Instead of envy, we have kindness. Instead of gluttony, we have moderation. Instead of lust, we have chastity in all of its forms. Instead of anger, we have patience. Instead of greed, we have charity or generosity. And instead of sloth, we have diligence. That is where we were going with this series. We're going to pick it up with the first of the 7 this Wednesday on Ash Wednesday service. But for now, I'm going to stop right there. I want us all to be able to move now to this table. We need it now more than ever.